She came into Harlan Creek on a freight wagon, which told you everything and nothing at all about a woman's circumstances. The driver had been kind enough to let her ride in the back with a crate of dry goods and a roll of fencing wire, and she had thanked him with the quiet, unhurried dignity of someone who had long ago stopped measuring her own worth by what kind of seat she was given. The town came into view slowly: a main road, a feed store, a livery, a building with a hand-lettered sign that said General Merchandise. And then the wagon slowed to a stop at the far end of the street, and she climbed down with a single canvas bag over one shoulder. Her name was Bess. She was 23 years old. She had no family, no fixed address, no letters of introduction beyond a folded note from a women's charitable society in Abilene that described her as honest, capable, and in good standing. She did not look around the town with the hungry, anxious gaze of a woman seeking rescue. She looked around with the steady, measuring eye of a woman, calculating what was available and what she could work with. She had been doing that her entire life. The note on the board outside the general store had been there for 11 days. The ink faded just enough to show it, curling slightly at one corner where someone had touched it and changed their mind. Housekeeper wanted. Chook and clean, light, mending references useful, but not required. Inquire Nathaniel Voss, Harlan Creek Mill Road, third property, past the creek bend. She considered what it meant that no one had taken it down yet. Either the man was particular, or the town knew something about the situation she didn't. Or both. She asked the woman behind a counter of the general store. The woman, stout, pleasant, with flour on her apron, set down her ledger and gave Bess the careful, measuring look of a person deciding how much to say. Nathaniel Voss, she said, was a decent man. A rancher mostly, though he kept a small plot and did some work for the mill in the slow months. 34 years old. His wife Clara had died 14 months ago, fever, a bad winter, nothing anyone could have done. He was managing. He had a daughter, Posy, who was 7 years old. The woman paused there. She said it gently. The little girl hadn't spoken since her mother died. Not a word. Not to her father, not to the neighbors, not to the teacher at school, not to anyone. She came and went like a small ghost, and she was clearly not stupid. She understood everything, said to her, answered questions with her eyes, followed directions without trouble. She simply had decided that words were done with her, or she, with them, and no one in the county had been able to change it. The woman looked at Bess. 2 other women had tried the position, she said. The first had left after 3 weeks, unnerved by the silence. The second had lasted 5 days, and told Nathaniel the child needed a doctor, not a housekeeper, which was perhaps not wrong, but was not especially useful either. Bess thanked the woman for her honesty. She picked up her bag and walked out toward Mill Road. The property sat at the end of a lane bordered by cottonwoods, their leaves pale gold in the late afternoon light. There was a modest house, 2 rooms visible from the outside, a small addition that might have been put up in a hurry, and behind it a barn and a corral where a gray horse stood in the dry autumn grass with the patient stillness, a kitchen garden, mostly picked clean for the season, but with a few late squash still on the vine, a rope swing tied to a cottonwood branch, not moving, no sound from inside. Bess stood at the gate for a moment. The place had the look of a house where someone was doing their level best, and the effort was visible without quite making up the difference. Firewood stacked with care, but not enough of it for a hard winter. A broken hinge on the barn door, propped shut with a stick, a curtain in the side window, clean and pressed, Someone cared about that, but the hem had come loose, and no one had fixed it yet. She unlatched the gate and walked to the front door and knocked. The man who opened it looked like a person who had been awake longer than one night, but was too stubborn to show it. Broad in the shoulders, dark-haired, going gray at the sides, hands that were roughened from outdoor work, he had the quiet face of a man who had decided early in life that words cost something, and he would spend them carefully. He looked at her with steady dark eyes and no particular expression. She told him her name. She told him she was here about the housekeeper position. She told him she was an orphan out of Abilene. She had worked domestic positions for 6 years. She could cook and clean and mend and manage a household, and she had a letter of reference from the charitable society if he wanted to see it. He looked at her steadily throughout all of this. He had a way of listening that was complete and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to use it properly. Most people listened while waiting for their turn to speak. Nathaniel Voss listened as though the thing being said actually mattered, and he was going to treat it that way. "I'll tell you plainly," he said. "There's a condition to this position." She waited. "My daughter," he said. "She doesn't speak, hasn't for over a year. She's not dim, and she's not broken, and she is not to be pitied or pressured or treated like something is wrong with her. She lost her mother, and she went quiet, and that is her way, and it will be respected in this house." He paused. "The last woman who came couldn't let it be. Kept at Posy every day to talk, as though silence was a problem to be fixed. Posy spent the whole time she was here with her shoulders up around her ears." His voice dropped slightly. "I will not have that happen again." Bess was quiet for a moment. "I grew up in an orphanage," she said. "I went quiet myself for about 2 years after my mother died. I was 5. Nobody talked to me about it. Nobody tried to fix me. They just let me be, and eventually I found my way back." She met his eyes. "I'm not interested in fixing her," she said. "I'm interested in keeping your house." Nathaniel Voss looked at her for a long time. "Come inside," he said. The kitchen was clean in the way of a man who had put effort into something he did not naturally think about. The floor had been swept, the dishes were stacked. The stove had been blacked at some point in the recent past, but the bread bin was empty, and there was a pot on the stove with something in it that had been there since morning and had not improved with age, and the table had been set with the slightly uncertain air of a man who had set his own table enough times to resent it. Bess set her bag in the small room. Nathaniel showed her her own door, which mattered, a window facing east, a narrow bed with a clean quilt. And then she came back into the kitchen and stood in front of the larder. She did not comment on the contents of the pot. She looked at what was available: dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, a string of onions, a crock of lard, some dried herbs that someone had hung with care, and she assembled a meal with the practiced economy of a woman who had been making something from close to nothing her whole life. She was 20 minutes into it when she became aware of being watched. She did not turn around. She kept working. There was a particular quality to being watched by a silent child. The air changed. The awareness of being observed was complete and unbroken. Most adults, when they were watching someone, shifted their weight or made small sounds. A cough, a breath, the creak of a floorboard under a restless foot. A silent child simply watched with absolute and unsettling thoroughness, as though they were reading you at a level you didn't know was available. Bess had spent enough of her childhood doing exactly this. She reached for the salt without turning. "There's a stool by the window," she said, conversationally. Not to anyone in particular, not with any particular expectation of answer. If you want to be in here, you can sit. Nothing for a moment. Then the quiet sound of a stool being dragged across the floor. Bess kept working. Posy was small for 7, slight, with dark hair like her father's pulled into 2 plaits that someone had attempted with effort but not quite mastered, and enormous brown eyes that took in everything with the patient thoroughness of a child who had learned to gather information from what people did rather than what they said. She wore a faded blue dress and a wool cardigan with 1 button missing and boots that had been polished recently, which was Nathaniel's work. Bess knew, a man doing the small things he knew how to do. She sat on the stool and watched Bess move around the kitchen. Bess told her what she was doing, not in the way of someone performing for a child, exaggerating each step with forced enthusiasm. In the quiet, matter-of-fact way of someone who was thinking out loud to themselves and happened to be audible about it. Beans need to have had some time in the water, she said, working. But salt pork makes up some of the difference if you get it started early enough. A pause, stirring. Cornbread's better with an egg. No eggs today, it'll be fine without. Posy watched. She did not answer. When Nathaniel came in from the corral, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. He took in the sight of his daughter sitting on the stool. His face changed in a way that he was careful not to let be visible, but Bess saw it from the corner of her eye. A quick, sharp flash of something he immediately contained. Set aside. Returned to the locked place where a grieving man kept his most painful observations. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread and a cider from a crock Bess had found at the back of the larder, slightly sharp, but good, and there was enough of it to fill the table with the smell of food properly made. Posy ate with the full, serious concentration of a child doing something important. Nathaniel ate without comment until he was nearly through the bowl, and then he said, quietly, "This is the first warm meal in this kitchen." Bess met his eyes across the table. "I'll be here tomorrow," she said. Posy looked at her father. Then she looked at Bess. Then she went back to her cornbread. But she had looked. A week passed, and then another. Bess established herself the way water establishes itself in a new channel, not by force, not with any great announcement, but by finding the shape of the space and filling it by nature. She learned the house, its rhythms, its needs, the way the east window got cold air through a gap in the frame, the way the stove drew better if you left the lower damper half open, the way the gray horse in the corral liked to be approached from the left. She learned Nathaniel's rhythms, too. He was up before light, worked outdoors through the cold morning, came in for coffee at 7:30, and was back out by 8. He hung his coat on the same hook every time, washed his hands at the basin, invariable, and sat down with the undemonstrative relief of a man who had been on his feet all day and was glad to be off them. But he was not an absent one. He paid attention to what was in the room. He noticed, for instance, that Bess left the kitchen window open in the afternoons, even in the cold, because Posy liked to come in from the yard and stand in the cold air before she came inside, and the open window let Bess know she was there. He noticed that when Posy was in the kitchen, Bess talked to herself, to the food, to the stove, to the barn cat that had taken to appearing at the back door, in a steady conversational monologue that required no response. Once he passed through the kitchen when Bess was explaining to the cat, in complete seriousness, the proper way to assess whether butter had gone off. Posy was on her stool, the cat was on the windowsill. He poured his coffee and went back to his work. The corner of his mouth had moved slightly. He put it back. Posy began to find reasons to be in the kitchen. Incrementally, arriving earlier, staying longer, moving from the stool to the table itself. She began to bring things, a stone from the creek, a feather, a small carved wooden horse that was clearly her mother's, that she set on the corner of the table when she sat and retrieved before she left. She did not speak, but she was present in the room with a quality that was different from simply being physically there. She was deciding something. Bess didn't push it. She made the conditions right. She cooked. She cleaned. She mended the curtain. Hem in the side window, she caulked the east window frame. On a cold morning, while Nathaniel was out, using a piece of old cloth and some tallow from the kitchen, which was not elegant, but was effective. She got the stove burning cleanly. She kept the bread bin full. She made on the 6th day a dried apple tart from a string of apples she found hanging in the root cellar, and the smell of it went through the house like an announcement. Posy appeared in the kitchen doorway within 2 minutes. Bess did not look up. "It wants another 20 minutes, she said to the stove, "but there's a piece of apple that fell out that's done." She put it on a small plate on the corner of the table. The sound of boots on the kitchen floor, the sound of a stool being moved, the small, serious sound of a child eating something warm and sweet. Harlan Creek was not a large town, and it was not an unkind one, but it had, as all small towns do, a certain relationship with other people's arrangements that ran to the persistent and occasionally uncomfortable. Bess heard things in the 2nd and 3rd week, in the way a woman hears things when she moves through a town, at the general store counter, in the spaces between pleasantries, in the polite and careful comments of women who had known Clara Voss and were forming opinions about what it meant that a quiet orphan woman from Abilene was now keeping house on Mill Road. Most of it was benign, some of it was the ordinary small cruelties of women who meant well and did not know it. A woman named Mabel Crouch, wide, capable, with a reputation for both charity and opinion, stopped her outside the dry goods one afternoon and said in the warm, concerned tone of someone doing a person a kindness they had not asked for, that it was good the little girl had some company, but that Bess ought to be careful about getting too settled in, given that these arrangements had a natural course and she was a young woman with prospects, and it would be a shame if she were to mistake a temporary situation for something else. Bess looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate the concern," she said. She bought her flour and walked home. She was not, she had long since decided, going to be moved by other people's measures of her circumstance. She had grown up in an institution that assessed her value on a quarterly basis and had found her acceptable enough to keep, but not exceptional enough to celebrate, and she had reached adulthood with a very clear and settled understanding that the opinions other people held about her life were theirs to keep. They were welcome to them. She had her own. She put Mabel Crouch's words in the same place she put most things that were offered without invitation, and walked home through the gold autumn afternoon, and put water on for tea, and found Posy already in the kitchen with a drawing she had made, a horse. Bess sat down at the table. She looked at the drawing. She said nothing for a moment. "That mane is ambitious," she said. Posy looked at her with complete and level seriousness. She pointed at the horse's mane, then at the coral in the yard, visible through the window. "You drew it from life," Bess said. Posy gave a single decisive nod. "Fair enough," Bess said. "He does have a mane like that." And she got up to pour the tea. He was not a complicated man, or rather, not complicated in the way people sometimes meant, full of obscure motives and interior drama. He was complex in the way that honest men who have been through loss tend to be, solid at the base, deeply formed, with a sorrow that had not broken him, but had changed the grain of him. He was careful with Bess, not cold, not distant, careful. He had the wariness of a man who had learned that need was its own kind of exposure, and he was not going to be exposed in his own kitchen. He said thank you when the meals were good, which they always were. He asked occasionally how she had made a particular thing with the genuine curiosity of a man who had cooked badly for himself for a year and recognized the gap between that and what she did. He fixed things around the property without comment. The barn door hinge appeared repaired on the 3rd week. The loose board on the porch steps was replaced on the 4th, and she treated these repairs with the same matter-of-fact silence he used for her work, which seemed to suit him. One evening in the 5th week, she came in from the garden at dusk, with the last of the squash, and found him standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, and the particular stillness of a man thinking about something he didn't intend to discuss. She put the squash on the counter. He didn't move. "Posy was at the window this afternoon," he said finally, not looking away from the yard. "She watched you in the garden for a long time." He turned then and looked at her, and there was a directness in his eyes that he had been holding back and had briefly let through. "She hasn't watched anyone like that," he said, "since Clara Bess was quiet." She put the squash in the bin and washed her hands at the basin. "She's getting ready for something," she said. "Children do that. They watch until they're sure, then they come." He looked at her for a long moment. He put his coffee cup down on the counter. He went back outside without another word. But the silence he left behind was not the silence of a man who had gone away. It was the silence of a man who had heard something and was going to carry it very carefully. There was a basket on the shelf above the kitchen window. It was a mending basket, wicker, with a fitted wooden lid. It sat in the same place it had always sat, and it had the particular stillness of an object that everyone in the house was aware of, and no one had touched. Bess had understood what it was within the 1st week. She had seen this before in the orphanage, in the houses where she had worked, in the rooms where grief lived, the preserved objects, the things that belonged to the person who was gone, kept in their place with a tender and painful exactness, as though moving them would mean moving on, and moving on was not yet something anyone in the house was ready for. She did not touch it. She dusted around it. She moved things on the shelf, a tin of matches, a jar of dried lavender, but the basket stayed where it was, untouched, and she made no comment about it. On a Sunday morning in the 6th week, Nathaniel was out at the corral and Posy was in the kitchen. She had been there since early morning, which she often was on Sundays. She was at the table with a slate and a piece of chalk, working on something that occupied her completely. The kitchen was warm and quiet, full of the smell of bread doing its second rise on the counter. Bess was mending a shirt, one of Nathaniel's work shirts, a button missing and a seam coming loose at the shoulder, and she was working without hurry, her needle going in and out, with the steady ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She looked up once and found Posy looking at the basket on the shelf, not with the guarded, sideways look of a child, hoping not to be caught, looking at something painful with a direct, clear, resting gaze. She was just looking at it the way you look at a thing you have thought about and are not yet done thinking about. Bess went back to her mending. After a long moment she said conversationally to the shirt, "My mother had a sewing box. Green tin, little painted flowers on the lid. I don't know what happened to it when she died. I was too small. Someone probably kept it. I used to think about that box a lot." She kept her eyes on the shirt. There was a long quiet in the kitchen. the sound of the bread doing its slow work on the counter, the sound of the horse shifting in the corral outside, then the sound of a stool being pushed back, the sound of small feet crossing the kitchen floor. Bess kept her eyes on the shirt. The sound of the brass clasp being opened. Then, very quietly, Posy set the basket on the table in front of her. Inside was a woman's sewing kit, needles in a card, thread in colors, a small pair of scissors, a silver thimble, a packet of extra buttons, everything carefully ordered. Posy took the thimble out and held it in both hands. She looked at it for a moment, then she held it out toward Bess. Bess looked at the thimble. She looked at Posy's face, the open-offered expression of a child who had made a decision of enormous significance and was presenting it as plainly as she could. She set her mending down. She held out her hand. Posy placed the thimble in her palm, carefully, and then sat on the bench beside her, not on the stool across the table, beside her. They sat together in the warm kitchen for a long time, the thimble between them and the bread rising on the counter, and the morning light coming through the east window, and neither of them needed to say anything because some things have already been said. It was a Tuesday. There was nothing remarkable about it in advance. Cold, the sky flat white, the kind of day that simply moves through without marking itself. Bess was in the garden, turning the last of the beds before the frost came in earnest. The work was cold, and the ground was reluctant, and she was working without thinking about it much, moving through the familiar rhythm of the fork and the turning and the slow progress of the row. She had come around from the back of the house without announcement, as she often did now. She had on her wool coat, and her hat, and her boots, and she was standing at the fence rail with her arms folded on the top bar, watching Bess work with the patient, observant attention she brought to everything. She told the fence post she was running out of row, and there was something satisfying about that. She told the cold sky that she thought there would be frost tonight. She hit a stone in the ground, a big one, buried deep, the fork going in at an angle and stopping cold. She worked at it for a moment, couldn't get purchase. She said something under her breath, nothing sharp, just the quiet exhale of a woman encountering an obstacle on a cold morning. She put the fork in the ground and crouched down and worked her hands around the stone. Got her fingers under it? It was bigger than she'd thought. She worked at it steadily, getting it loose, and then it shifted all at once, and she went back slightly with the release of it, landing on her heel in the cold dirt with the stone in her hands. She looked at it. It was satisfyingly large, the kind of stone that warranted some acknowledgment. From the fence, very quietly, came a voice she had not heard before. "Big one." 2 words. Bess stayed where she was for a moment. She did not make any sudden movement. She did not turn around with an expression of shock or pleasure or surprise. She did not say anything that announced the significance of what had just happened, because she understood, in the quiet and patient part of herself that had been a silent child once, that a first word is an extraordinarily fragile thing and will seal itself right back up if it is treated as an event. She looked at the stone. "Big one," she agreed in the same ordinary tone. "Real nuisance." A pause. Then from the fence. "Put it by the gate." Bess looked up. Posy was still at the fence, arms on the top bar, entirely composed, as though she had been saying things all along. "By the gate," Bess said. Posy gave a single nod. "You put rocks by the gate?" Another nod. Then, after a moment, said they keep the posts straight. Bess looked at the stone in her hands. She got up and carried it to the gate and set it down beside the post, with care, exactly as though this were a ritual she had always known about. "Good idea," she said. She went back to the garden. They worked together in the cold morning without talking much. Posy moving along the outside of the fence collecting smaller stones, Bess turned up and lining them along the gate-post, and Bess turning the beds with the fork, and the silence between them was not the old silence, the sealed and careful silence of a child who has gone away. The companionable kind, the silence of two people who are doing something together and don't need words to hold it. When Nathaniel came in from the barn an hour later, he found Bess at the kitchen table warming her hands around a cup of coffee and Posy beside her, also with a cup, more milk than coffee, which Bess had made with the seriousness of a formal occasion. She was telling Bess about the time the grey horse had gotten into the kitchen garden and eaten the green beans, every last one, and her mother had been so cross she had made the horse apologize directly and then argued with her father about whether horses understood apology. She was talking the way children talk when they have been keeping things inside for a long time, and something has finally opened, not quite a flood, more like a river, finding its proper channel, sure and continuous moving. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his hat in his hand. Posy looked up and saw him. She said, "Papa, did Mama make the horse apologize, or is that not true?" He did not move for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and crouched down beside her, and he said with great care, "She absolutely did." And he stood there and took it too, because even horses know better than to argue with your mother. Posy said he probably knew what he'd done. "He knew?" Nathaniel said. His voice was very even and very steady, and Bess looked at the window and kept her eyes there, and let him have the moment. It changed the way houses change when the air inside them is allowed to breathe again, incrementally, through the accumulation of small things that in themselves were nothing, and together were everything. She talked with the ordinary, constant flow of a 7-year-old, who has been storing up observations for 14 months and finds herself suddenly in possession of an audience. She told Bess about her mother, about the way the light came through the window at the end of summer, which her mother had called the honey light, about the book of pressed flowers, and how she and her mother used to check on the garden in the evenings, and her mother would tell each plant what was expected of it. She told Bess things she had apparently not told anyone. She did not say the wrong things, not the things people say when they try too hard. She said things that were true and specific. She sounds like someone who took gardens seriously. That's a good system, talking to the plants. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered details from 3 days ago. Children notice who is actually listening. Nathaniel noticed too. He noticed that Posy had begun to sleep through the night, that she started eating with appetite, that she started pulling at his sleeve again the way she had when she was small to show him things. A feather, a stone, the cat asleep in an unlikely position. That when she fell and skinned her knee, she cried loudly, briefly, and was fine, instead of the old braced, pale stillness of a child who has learned that hurting is safer done alone. He carried all of this without saying anything because he was that kind of man. But Bess saw him carry it. On an evening in the 7th week, she was washing the supper dishes, and he was at the table still, which he did not usually do. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, Posy gone to bed, the kitchen quiet. He said without preamble, "What you've done for her, what's been happening with her, I don't have the words for it. She did it herself," she said. "I just kept the kitchen warm." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you came from nothing," he said. "I know what it is you left and what kind of road brought you here. I'm not going to pretend I don't know that." She did not say anything. "I want you to know," he said, that whatever brought you here, I think it brought you here for a reason." She dried her hands on the cloth by the stove. She turned around. He was looking at her with the plain, level honesty of a man who had decided to say something true and was seeing it through. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she said. "That means something to me." He nodded once. He got up and went to see about the fire. It was the general store again, which seemed to be where Harlan Creek staged its complications. Bess was at the counter with a list when a man she had not met before came in. He was around her age, well-dressed for a ranch town, with the particular confidence of someone who had made choices and decided to be satisfied with them. He introduced himself as Frank Dern. He said he had been in Laramie for 6 weeks and had only just heard that the Voss place had taken on a housekeeper. He looked at her with a frankness that was just on the edge of impoliteness. He asked pleasantly whether she found the position satisfactory, and she said she did, and he said he imagined it was a quiet life for a young woman, just the two of them and a child, and she said it suited her, and he said the reason he asked was that he ran a rooming house in town, and he had an opening for a cook, better wages, more company. Not out on a lane by herself and a woman of her obvious capabilities. Here, he smiled in a way that knew itself, really ought to have prospects. She thanked him. This was the thing about being an orphan. You developed, very young, an extremely accurate instinct for offers that were really about something else. Frank Dern's offer was genuine enough on its surface. But she had heard the shape of it, and she was not interested. She realized as she walked up the lane under the gold cottonwood leaves, not interested in anything that was not this. She hadn't expected that. She had arrived in Harlan Creek with nothing more planned than the next position, the next roof. She had not come looking for anything that mattered beyond the immediate. She had been an orphan long enough to know not to reach for things that could be taken away, but she was in it now. In the kitchen, with the warm stove, and the cat on the sill, and the sound of Posy at the table, and the particular silence of Nathaniel Voss moving through his house. She was in it the way you are in something you have, without noticing, built your life around. She pushed the gate open. Posy was at the rope swing under the cottonwood, not swinging, just sitting and moving slightly, pushing herself in slow, small circles with one foot. She looked up when Bess came through the gate. "You were a long time," she said. "I was," Bess said. "I ran into someone." "Good. Someone or bad someone." Bess considered this. "Ordinary someone," she said. "Not worth much thought." Posy accepted this. She pushed herself in another slow circle. "There's a mouse in the kitchen," she said. "I didn't know if you'd want to know." "I definitely want to know," Bess said. "Thank you for that." "You're welcome," said Posy. It was November, and the frost was in the mornings now in earnest. Nathaniel was in the barn before light. He had been doing that, waking before the house, in the cold hour when everything was still, going through the barn by lantern light, doing the horses and the feed, and the small repairs that the days never had enough room for. It was the time he had, early on, done his grieving out of sight, in the cold, where no one had to see it. He still came out early, but the quality of the time had changed. He came out because he liked the early hours, not because he needed to hide in them. He was coming back from the barn at 5:30, the lantern in one hand, when he stopped. There was a light in the kitchen already. He stood at the barn door for a moment, looking at it, the small lit square of the kitchen window against the dark yard. She was up at 5:30 because she had noticed that he was up at 5:30 and had decided without comment to have coffee ready. He had been noticing things about her for some weeks now in the careful and reluctant way a man notices things when he has decided in advance not to. The way she talked to Posy, not performing kindness, but actually kind, in the specific and patient way that could not be faked. The way she moved through the house, purposeful, quiet, entirely at home in her body. The way she laughed when something was actually funny, not the polite social laugh, but the real one. The one that came before she could stop it. He crossed the yard. He came in through the back door and hung his coat, and she had a cup on the counter for him already, without having turned around, and he stood there for a moment, with the warmth of the kitchen after the cold of the yard and the smell of coffee and bread. He picked up the cup. She turned and leaned against the counter. They stood in the kitchen in the early morning and the dark outside, and he thought that there were things he could say right now that he had not said to anyone since Clara, not because he had not felt them, but because feeling and saying were separate actions. He looked at her. She was looking back at him, in her steady, even way, not filling the silence, not asking anything of it. He said, "You've been good for this house." "I've tried," she said. "No," he said, "that's not what I mean. I mean you've been good for it in a way I didn't expect was possible. I thought it would always be the way it was. After Clara, I thought He paused. The warmth. I thought it was gone for good. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to take the time you need to answer it, because I'm not asking out of convenience or circumstance." He met her eyes. "I'm asking because of you specifically, because of who you are." She held his gaze. He said what he meant, plainly and without dressing it. The way he said everything. He wanted to know if she would consider staying, not as the housekeeper, as his wife, if she would have it. He knew what he was, and he knew what he had, a house that needed things, and a child who needed more, and a man who had been cracked open by grief, and was possibly not the easiest proposition. But he was also, he said, a man who had not asked anything of the world in 14 months, and he was asking this. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the dark had lightened to the gray before sunrise, that particular gray that is not quite night and not yet morning, but holds both of them. Bess looked at him for a long time. She had been that orphan girl for so long that the girl who deserved something, a house, a family, a person who looked at her and said specifically, "You felt like a stranger," she might not recognize. She had built her life around provisional things, around positions and arrangements, and the careful management of not needing too much. She had been growing a different kind of life, here on Mill Road, without fully acknowledging it. She said, "I didn't come here expecting this." "I know," he said. "I came here with a bag and a letter of reference." "I know that too." "I would stay," she said, "if you're sure." "I've been sure for about 3 weeks," he said. "I've been being careful about saying it." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "All right," she said. "Then yes." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and put his hand out palm up, the old-fashioned gesture, the one that meant more than a handshake, and she put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it. The coffee was getting cold on the counter. Neither of them moved for a long while. They told Posy at breakfast. Nathaniel said it plainly. He had asked Bess to stay as part of the family. Bess had said yes, and he wanted Posy to know first. Posy looked at her father. She looked at Bess. She looked at her oatmeal. "Does this mean you won't leave?" "It means I won't leave," Bess said. Posy considered this with the full, thorough seriousness she brought to important things. "Can I still help you in the kitchen?" "Always," Bess said. And she went back to her oatmeal. Nathaniel looked at Bess across the table with an expression that contained in its entirety a year and a half of grief and relief, and something that was beginning to look, very quietly, like the future. Bess got up and put more bread on the plate. The morning went on around them. The grey horse in the corral, the cat coming to the back door, November light through the kitchen window, landing on the shelf where the mending basket sat. It was still there. It would always be there. But it was on the shelf with other things now. A tin of Bess's tea, a small drawing Posy had made of the four of them, a sprig of dried lavender. It was just a shelf, carrying the things of a household that was alive. They were married in December, at the small church at the end of Main Street on a Thursday, because that was the day that worked for the minister, and there was no reason to wait for a better one. The Reverend McAllister married them at 10 in the morning with 4 witnesses, 2 of whom were neighbors, and one of whom was the woman from the general store who had told Bess the truth about the position when she had asked for it, and who wept briefly and unstoppably and did not apologize for it. The 4th witness was Posy, who stood beside Bess in a wool dress that Bess had mended and pressed the night before, her hair in 2 plaits that Bess had done properly, holding a small bunch of dried flowers she had made from the garden, lavender. Were going to be in December. They were going to have to be dried ones, and this seemed right to her. It was cold. The church was not well heated. Everyone kept their coats on. The ceremony was short. The minister believed in not embellishing what did not need embellishment, and at the end of it Nathaniel took Bess's hand and held it, and looked at her in his direct, unhurried way, the way he had looked at her the first day, calculating. She had on her good dress, which was not fine, but was clean and well kept, and her hair was done in the way she wore it for occasions. She did not look like a woman performing joy. She looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere she had not known she was heading for, and found it to be the right place. They walked out of the church into the cold December morning, with Posy between them holding both their hands, and the town, some of it, the part that had come out despite the cold, watched from the boardwalk, and someone. Mabel Crouch was on the boardwalk outside the dry goods. She watched them go past. She said loudly enough to carry, "Well, that's as it should be." Bess did not look at her. She was looking at the road ahead, at the lane that led to Mill Road, at the property with the cottonwoods and the corral and the kitchen window. She was thinking about the mending basket on the shelf, about the thimble in her palm, about 2 words said over a fence at the edge of a garden in November, big one, about how the smallest things are the load-bearing ones. Winter settled over Harlan Creek with the heavy, committed patience of a winter that intends to stay. The house on Mill Road was warm. This was not a small thing. It had not been warm, not in the real sense, not warm in the way that a house is warm when all the people in it are present, when the cold outside is noted and accounted for. It was warm now. There was bread baking in a reliable rotation, and the stove was tended well, and the firewood was sufficient for the winter, stacked in good order behind the barn, and in the evenings the lamp was on the kitchen table where everyone gathered in the natural way of a family that has come to occupy the same space with the ease of habit. Posy talked. She talked about everything. About the horse, and the cat, and the things she was learning at school, and the book she was reading, and the things Bess had told her, about the garden, and the things that she was going to plant in the spring. She talked about her mother, sometimes not with pain, not with the guarded, careful way she had used the first times, but with the open, remembering ease of a child who has come to understand that loving a person who is gone, she called Bess, Bess, not Mama, Bess. Bess was fine with this. She had not expected anything else and wanted nothing more than what was given freely. Bess was something else, something for which there was perhaps no single word in the common language, which was all right, because the thing itself was clear enough. She was the woman who had been here. She was the woman who kept the kitchen warm, and the bread on the table and the garden in order, and the house running with the steady, capable hand of someone who had been doing hard work her whole life, and found in this work the specific meaning she had spent those years looking for without knowing it. She was, more than anything, the woman who had known how to wait. On a Sunday evening in January, the house was full of ordinary things. Nathaniel was at the table with a piece of account work, his pen moving steadily. Posy was on the rug in front of the stove, with the cat asleep on her legs, reading the book of stories that had been on the shelf since before, reading it with the full absorption of a child who does not need anyone's company. Bess was at the kitchen window. She was standing with a cup of tea in both hands and looking out at the yard, at the dark shape of the barn, and the pale line of snow along the corral fence and the stars beginning to come out above the cottonwoods. The cold pressed against the glass, and the warmth of the kitchen pressed back, and between the two of them, the window held its ground. She was thinking about the girl she had been, the one who went quiet in a room in an orphanage in Abilene when she was 5 years old, and learned to stay very still and wait. That girl had made it through. She had carried her silence like a tool, not a wound, and she had arrived here with it in a cold October on a freight wagon, and it had turned out to be exactly the right thing. The right thing for Posy, the right thing for the man at the table who had stopped pretending he wasn't listening and had looked up. He was looking at her with the quiet, particular attention he had given her from the first day on Mill Road. In his eyes was the thing she had been gathering carefully for weeks without letting herself believe in it, the look of a man who is home. She looked back at him. Then she looked out the window again, at the yard and the snow and the cold stars. This is what it is to be found, not by luck, not by circumstance, but by your own patience and the slow, quiet courage of staying. The cat stretched on Posy's legs and settled again. The stove did its steady work. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the snow on the fence rail shifted, and the house held everything it was holding. If you stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Stories like this one are why we're here. If it moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs a good story today. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week, and there are many more still to come.